All right, welcome to session 4. Today we're looking at what is a vignette. We have two objectives today. The first one is I can define and identify the elements of a vignette. So if you can explain in words what is a vignette and call it out, that's success. The second objective is I can read and analyze vignettes for the author's choices in crafting a compelling vignette. So basically what we're doing is we're looking at vignettes and we're trying to figure out what makes these stories compelling. Just a quick review. Our essential question is just what is a vignette? What are the characteristics of a vignette? All right, so today's agenda is going to look a touch different than normal. We're going to use the same platform Edpuzzle that we used for the danger of a single story in our previous lesson. I'm going to pair it today with some guided notes. So what you're going to be doing is you'll be watching this video and you can pause throughout, click over to your guided notes in your Google Doc, and anytime you see a box or a line, you're going to fill that in. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at some independent work. I have a really good vignette for you called Little Things Are Big that we're going to read and annotate, and then the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at a mastery check. As usual, that will be a Google form. All right, here's our key vocab for today. Vignette is our huge term. We got to define it. We got to identify it. We need to be able to elaborate on it. By the end of this lesson, if you can describe in your own words what a vignette is, I'll be a super happy teacher. The next thing is time, place, and perspective. Now, these are three really key elements of high-quality storytelling. We got to orient the audience to time. We need to give them a feeling of the place, and then perspective is maybe the most unique of these. It's the viewpoint that we're telling the story from or putting the audience in. So we'll get deeper into that. So these are going to be your vignette prompts. In our next lesson, we're going to write on a few of these. These are 6 options I'm providing you. There's a 7th that's not on the screen that basically in a nutshell is what is your life like now that we're in a pandemic? But here are kind of the 6 stock prompts that I want to offer. One could be an object related to a place. Another could be a decision you've made or your neighborhood or another place that has some significance to you. The 4th option is an event in your life. The 5th is a person. And the 6th is kind of a moment of laughter or like a short, funny story. All right, one more thing. The very last thing I forgot is in your guided notes, you will see a box with the number 1, 2, and 3. What I'd love for you to think about right now is which 3 of these prompts really stick out to you and rank those 1, 2, and 3. So number 1 is going to be the prompt that you're most interested in. Number 2 is going to be your second best, and number 3 is going to be your third best. All right, here we go. Continuing with the guided notes, we're looking at what is a vignette. Here's the definition. So in your notes, you'll see there's some lines that you'll fill in. What I'd love for you to do is delete that line, type in what you see on the screen here. So a vignette is a brief and evocative description or account of a place, person, object, event, or an idea. So you may find yourself asking, what the heck does evocative mean? Pause this video, look it up. There's a box in your guided notes to write what evocative is. But it's short, it's focused, it's 1 or 2 scenes. It's not an entire story. It's a snapshot in time. It focuses mainly on a topic and an emotion. A vignette always has like a dominant emotion threaded through the story, whether it's like intense or whether it's emotional or sympathetic or suspenseful. The emotion kind of like is persistent through the vignette. The last characteristic of a vignette is it doesn't need to have a traditional plot. So I know you've been taught for years and years and years that a story does this. A story has some rising action, a story has a climax, it has some falling action, and then there's a resolution. We're not doing that right now. What we're doing is we're showing the viewer a snapshot in time. So for example, your vignette could be just the rising action right here, and that's okay. Your vignette could be like literally the moment of the climax, and that's okay. We're talking about like minutes and hours here. It's short. It's not like weeks and days, and that's okay to not follow the conventions of like traditional storytelling. All right, so in other words, a vignette is a descriptive sketch. We want to make it as vivid for the viewer as possible. It's a glimpse of a single moment, or put another way, it's a snapshot. It's just a moment in time. And essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to paint a picture with words. We, as digital storytellers, have the benefits of music and images and video and all these things, even the emotion of our voice, way, way, way better than just words on a page. So that's kind of the goal of what we're going for in our vignette. So every day in class, we watch a digital story and we reflect on it. But for the purposes of this vignette lesson, I really wanted to try to communicate what a vignette could be just using a still image. So if you take a look at the right side of your screen, you'll see this black and white image, and it's of the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, Germany. And this is a place I've had the privilege to visit when I was in college. And here's what it is. It's a giant memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. And it's an entire city block, like a big city block. And what it is it's these big stone or marble pillars, and they're in these rows. So if you look at these, they're in these rows that don't quite go straight. So like when you get to the center of this memorial, you can't actually see out. Like in this case, you can actually see daylight, you can see out. But if you start on one side and look all the way across, like you can't see through it. Another thing is that at times these pillars are like below your eye level. They're like 3 or 4 feet tall. But when you get to the center, they're like 10, 12, 15 feet tall. And you feel kind of like dwarfed by these giant pillars. Another thing that I don't know if you can notice, but the ground isn't even. So like it's sloping a little to the left, and then as you see, if you go away, it's actually going like downhill. So you're like, not only is it sloping to the left, it's sloping like down or uphill at the same time. So as you're walking through these columns, you anticipate it to be like orderly and like straight lines and level floors, but it's all the opposite. And the sensation that it gives the participant is that it's just like super disorienting. When you go in there, you often like lose the people you're with, sound travels in weird ways, and you're just like kind of off and put on your heels. And this would be, in my opinion, an excellent example of what a vignette could be, of just like a quick 2 or 3 minute story about like what this experience was like for me. All right, next up, characteristics of vignettes. So basically, the biggest characteristic is a vignette's got to evoke emotion. So that should be front and center when you're telling your story. What's the emotion that you're driving for? The language in vignettes that oftentimes helps evoke this emotion is there's detail, there's description. The biggest thing is there's imagery. And another huge one is sensory details. So if the viewer or the listener can see, feel, touch, or hear what's going on, that's the key. We want to focus on the thoughts and the feelings of the people in the story. And then oftentimes time, place, and perspective are huge. So I chose this image here on purpose because this is a really great example of perspective. So if you want to tell a story about someone in a lifeboat, you have lots of choices as a storyteller for how to tell that. This kind of like big bird's eye view gives a totally different sensation than if the perspective was like in the boat with the people like up close and personal. So these are some characteristics of vignettes. Take a pause on this slide. Make sure to transfer these notes to your guided notes. All right, next thing, we're going to look at some images and emotion. The 2 questions I have to frame this passage for you are these. The first are, what images do you see and what does the picture in your head look like? We're going to be highlighting these in yellow. The other question I have for you is, which emotions come to mind? So the cool thing about storytelling is for every person, there's going to be a different emotion or image that comes to mind, or even a memory. So as we read, the storyteller may have some intention for what they want us to feel, but as the audience, like, we're going to feel what we feel, and part of it is practicing that on the receiving end as the audience. So I'm going to go over the first few lines of this, and then you can finish it up on your own. But the first line sticks out to me so strongly. He didn't see the gun. So to me, what this makes me think of is, like, if I could picture this image in my head of, like, what this movie scene would be like, it would be like a camera facing at someone, and slowly into the frame a body, or maybe just an arm or a hand, kind of like creeps in, unbeknownst to the person in front of the camera. And that's like how I picture this moment. As with the footsteps, the fog muffled the shots, so they sounded low, thick, odd. So what I'm thinking here is, I've of course experienced fog, but we don't have tons of fog here in Denver. What I'm actually thinking about is, you know when it snows in the city and everything's really quiet, like buses can fly down the road and it just like barely sounds like anything? I'm thinking about that, like snow kind of dampening or like muffling the sounds. So I'm kind of thinking about connecting like with that memory that I have of like a snowy day in the city where it's normally really noisy, and it's not. It's really quiet. They puzzled him in that instant of shocking pain. He reached for his own gun. It never occurred to him. He fell, eyes wide, mouth working, but the words were only gurgles. So here's what this makes me think of. When I read, he fell, eyes wide, mouth working, I'm almost thinking of like a cliche scene in a war movie where like a soldier shot and like on the ground, like his eyes are like super huge and dilated. All right, and then the next part, he heard, as if from a great distance, his killer's voice. I'm sorry, it wasn't supposed to be like this. So what I'm thinking when I read this, like the emotion I'm feeling is like, I'm almost envisioning this guy like on the ground looking up, just like alone, like almost like the camera panning out, like the world is kind of like fading away from him. And maybe even this like voice kind of like echoing, like this ominous voice kind of echoing. So like the emotion to me would be like this kind of like evil villain voice kind of speaking this quote. All right, so you finish it up. Keep highlighting, add notes in your graphic organizer in your guided notes for the images of the memories or the emotion that you have while you're reading, and then I'll see you on the next slide. So what I did here is I tried to just like add some images to like try to communicate the images and the emotion that I felt. So like I found this like super dense, foggy picture of a forest. And then like I described earlier, this like kind of feeling of loneliness and isolation, I think that was kind of encapsulated by this photo here. So here's a quick recap of what vignettes are, the characteristics of a vignette. So first of all, they're short and sweet. If it can fit on a note card, it's probably a vignette. The next thing is it appeals to the senses. It uses lots of sensory details. So if you can smell it, you can touch it, you can feel it, you can taste it, you can hear it. That's what we're talking about. The next characteristic of a vignette in a nutshell is it relies very heavily on emotion. So it should be crystal clear to your audience what emotion you're attempting to convey, what thoughts and feelings you're attempting to have the viewer experience. And the last thing right here is vignettes are all about the details and what images you want the audience to have in their mind. All right, so the next thing in your guided notes I'd love for you to do is there's a box with two sides. The left side is this. In your own words, describe a vignette. Next, I want you to explain how a vignette is different than a short story. And in the next slide, we're going to get a little deeper into that. So in your guided notes, I have a Venn diagram, kind of sort of similar to the one you see on the screen. The one in your notes is going to be blue and green. But what I want you to do is try to identify the similarities and the differences between a vignette and a short story. And since we can't very easily type into a Venn diagram in your notes, what I've done is I've given you that visual up above, but then down below, it's just like a table with like 3 columns. So on the left-hand side that's green, you'll write what are the characteristics of a short story that are specific only to that. The blue in the right-hand column are what are the characteristics of a vignette. And then that kind of greenish blue column in the middle is the overlapping part. So that's where I'd love for you to communicate what are the common similarities between a vignette and a short story. All right, so now I'm going to cut you all loose to do a little independent work. Please read the directions, and what you'll be doing is you'll be reading a short vignette called Little Things Are Big, and you'll be annotating however you prefer. You can highlight, you can underline, you can comment using the Google feature, whatever you want to do. But what we're doing is we're looking for a few things that we just learned about. What's the imagery that comes to your mind? What's the picture in your head? And then what emotions are surfacing for you as you read through the story.